The United States apparently increasingly concerned after top secret documents showing Israel's plan for a potential retaliatory strike on Iran were leaked to an Iranian Telegram account on Friday. Hal, what do we know about those documents?
Well, it's a little bit shocking. Corel, what showed up on was a Telegram website or Telegram account, I should say. That's a social media account. It's used by, so it's used here in the U.S., but it's used especially by Iran, Russia, and a number of, dare I say, nefarious state actors for information. Well, it was a pro-Iranian account that it showed up on, and it looked like what it was showing was imagery, if you will, satellite imagery from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, NGA, and also what appeared to be transcripts of intercepted conversations. And what it had on it was National Security Agency, NSA, which does signals intelligence. All the reports coming out on it right now from so far unattributed U.S. officials makes it sound like this may have been a genuine issue. I mean, this was not something that someone just fabricated. And of course, the question is, was is this a penetration of U.S. intelligence somewhere? The other concern is, was it hacked? And I don't know which one would be more concerning, if there was a successful breach through a hack or if there was an actual mole or something in U.S. intelligence. Now, the interesting thing is that it has what's called the Five Eyes. It has, released to the countries that compose the Five Eyes. Of course, the U.S. being one of those, and then of Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand. And this is a special intelligence arrangement that goes back to World War II with how we share intelligence within those five countries. So when looking at it, it does raise the question, could it have been one of the other members of the Five Eyes that was the source of the leak? Now, in Israel, their concern is that it's talking about all the preparations they're doing for the big strike in Iran. It wasn't specific as to targeting, as to what they're going to hit, but it does talk about that. It shows preparations at different air bases. It talked about different types of training they were doing, a variety of things like that. Type of ordnance that they might be using was kind of inferred from it as well. So Israel's probably sitting there saying, oh my gosh, some of our planning and preparations have been compromised. And the other part is they're probably saying, well, they're really spying on us a lot. I mean, they're looking at satellite photos of what we're doing and intercepting our conversations. So I'm not sure how that's going to play at a diplomatic level, shall we say, of that sort of thing. So it's going to be a big flap. I expect to hear more of it as the week goes on.
So, a U.S. official also told CNN that the leak, is, quote, deeply concerning. And what's interesting is that earlier today we did hear from the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. He's in Italy for the G7. And he had said that the U.S. would like Israel to scale back its attacks on Lebanon, particularly near the capital. But is that likely? And what kind of incentives does the U.S. have in order for Israel to scale back those attacks?
Well, of course, the biggest incentive is that we're the biggest backer of Israel. We provide weapons and all sorts of other support to Israel. So, of course, we have that leverage, if you will, with Israel, and saying that. You know, that kind of going back to the leak a little bit, there was some sort of Machiavellian thought that maybe the U.S. or one of the other Five Eyes members, may have leaked it intentionally in order to do exactly what Secretary Austin was talking about, which is to somewhat coerce Israel into scaling back the degree of its strike on Iran. I thought that was rather, rather Byzantine, to put it lightly, that something like that was going. And I don't think that's where it was sourced from. I find that less likely than the alternatives. But that was being discussed as well. But there is a lot of concern with the U.S. and some of our partners, of course, that whatever Israel does, that they might widen the conflict even further. And of course, the problem is they're seeing nations in the Middle East, other nations like Iran, certainly Hezbollah, which is not a nation but a major threat group in southern Lebanon, and Hamas in Gaza that they're not backing down. You know, Hamas is still pushing forward, Hezbollah is pushing forward, and Iran may feel compelled to respond even more strongly.
Sticking with these leaks and also what the Secretary of Defense had said, what does this tell us about how the U.S. feels on the trajectory of this war?
Well, the fear is, of course, it'll widen the conflict. It's interesting. I think the hope was that when Sinwar was killed, that this might be an entree to get some sort of ceasefire deal put in place in the Gaza Strip. That's not looking any closer right now. Also, there was some hope that certainly at the end of last week, with Lebanon pushing really hard and Hezbollah's somewhat public acquiescence, that there might be a separate ceasefire deal for just southern Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah. I don't rule that out, but it does appear that certainly for Israel, they have a lot more things they want to accomplish from a military standpoint before they agree to anything. And the other problem is that there are certain stipulations of what that agreement would look like that Hezbollah just simply is not there. You know, part of that is that they pull all their forces out of the area in the UN Resolution 1701 south of the Litani River. Well, that has not happened. There's a disarmament provision of Hezbollah on that. That certainly has not happened. So there seems to be a long way to go before they could get to something where it would be a more permanent ceasefire type arrangement, let alone peace, if you want to call it that.
I want you to talk a little bit about what was leaked in this document as well, because I do have the report here. It was a report from CNN, and it says that the document described Israel moving munitions around and Israeli Air Force
Mhm.
exercises involving air to surface missiles, seemingly in preparation for an attack on Iran. Given kind of these tidbits from that leaked document, what would that attack look like?
Well, for Iran, they could certainly go back and figure out, okay, they're pulling this type, they're going to use this type of ordnance, and they're doing this type of training, which means they're looking at these types of strikes. And certainly, any target intelligence officer could go back and look at that and say, well, based on that, I think they're looking at these particular targets. I think this is how they plan to prosecute these particular targets, depending on the specificity of what's in there, and certainly what they can, they take from what they know to what they have now and what they can put together from that. Certainly, Iran knows where its potential targets, things that Israel would like to hit. They know what those are. That's not an unlimited number of possibilities. And within that, they have certainly looked at how Israel might potentially try to strike those. So they already have dare I say, a template of how Israel might want to do that. So you take whatever you glean from these documents, you put that, you apply that, or compare it against the template of what you think or what they would think Israel would do, and that would narrow down the number of targets that Israel would possibly be looking at. So you can actually glean a lot of information, a lot of intelligence from a limited array of information within the documents, not just what was leaked, but it's what was leaked in context with what's already known. And that's where, basically Iran would develop greater insight on what Israel wants to do. And of course, the consequences are that they could shift around their air defense assets and put Israeli Air Force pilots at greater risk doing those missions, because frankly, they would have said, look, this is how we think they're going to come in. This is what we think they're going to do, and take all the countermeasures that they possibly can in order to, mitigate that risk. And that's another way of saying trying to shoot down the Israeli aircraft. So there is a real human danger when stuff like this comes out. There's a lot of things that certainly Israel is assessing right now. And and frankly, this leak will probably end up pushing things back, because I would imagine they're going to go back and relook at everything and make some changes simply to create a greater degree of uncertainty with the Iranians as to how Israel plans to strike.
Al, when we spoke earlier about you coming onto the program, this wasn't even the story that we were going to cover. So this is coming on the
Mhm.
heels of another headline that we're following. I want to showcase some video here that was provided to us a little earlier today, and this has to do with a drone that was launched toward Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's house early on Saturday. That was confirmed by the Israeli government. Now, there were no casualties. Neither Netanyahu nor his wife were home. Now, this comes after Israel's war with Lebanon's Hezbollah has grown worse in the last couple of weeks. The first question is, how does a drone get so close to Netanyahu's house?
I think that's the same question that Netanyahu's been asking of the Israeli Defense Force chief of staff, which is how did a drone get so close to my house? The question is, what is the gap in the Iron Dome and the Israeli air defense picture that allows this drone to get into the to the prime minister's home? And then on the heels of another drone strike that hit a military base where it killed 4 IDF soldiers, seriously injured dozens of others, hitting this mess hall, this cafeteria, if you will, when it was full of troops, a concentrated troop target, if you will. How did it get in there? And then, of course, this falls, some weeks after, or I should say, a couple months after the Houthi drone that managed to go out and fly right into metropolitan Tel Aviv. Again, theoretically, with the Iron Dome, none of these things should have happened, but they did happen. And so they're going to be looking at a number of things, which is the technical capabilities of the drone will certainly be looked at very closely. Seeing if the drone has anything where it's able to somehow fly in a more stealthy mode or somehow evade radar or any other detection before it gets all the way in there. So they're going to be looking at tactics, techniques, procedures that the Hezbollah drone operators are using that they could get in this far. They'll be looking at timing of when the drone came in to see if maybe there's some gap tied to that. They'll be looking at a number of different things, but the big question is how are they able to pull something like this off? And of course, you could extrapolate out and say if they can hit the prime minister's house, who else could they hit? If that's supposed to be a more well-defended property, I would say, than a number of other homes and properties in Israel. So the question would be, well, if they can hit here, where else can they hit? And that really gets into the whole psychological dimension of warfare, which is causing great uncertainty and of course casting doubt upon the IDF and Israel's ability to defend against attacks like this.
And then the next question is, what capabilities need to be in place to make sure that this does not happen again?
Well, one thing they're going to be looking at are drone countermeasures, all right, anti-drone systems. It's interesting. You may recall this week, we put a terminal high altitude air defense THAAD system with about 100 U.S. troops that we actually deployed into Israel. And a lot of people say, with their Iron Dome system, why do they need this? And it was to plug a gap with a specific ballistic missile capability. And they were saying hypervelocity ballistic missiles, which I always find a rather interesting term because most ballistic missiles flying at high altitude are hypervelocity because that's simply how fast they've always flown. But they're trying to plug this gap with this U.S. High altitude air defense system. And that was something they saw from the attack that just occurred in early October, where some of the Iranian ballistic missiles, even though they were knocked off, for the most part, knocked off track, they had one impacted 500 yards from Mossad headquarters. They had a couple of hit an air base that had F-35s, our most advanced fighter bombers that we provide the Israelis. So they needed to plug those gaps, and that was one thing. Now they're going to be looking closer to Earth, so to speak, which is gaps in the low altitude realm, which is where these drones are probably flying. Again, I don't know what altitude or what trajectory these drones came in on. I don't know what their flight path. I don't know if they were doing something like nap of the Earth, where they were flying so low to the Earth that that they couldn't pick them up on radar. I don't know if they were command controlled or completely autonomous. So these are things that the IDF is going to have to figure out. Something that Shin Bet, their domestic intelligence service, is going to be looking at very closely. as well to try and find out everything they can about this. And then the other question is, even though they're saying they're launched by Hezbollah, I can't rule out that they could have been launched from somewhere else. They could even be Hezbollah launched drones and maybe launched from a location other than, say, southern Lebanon, maybe somewhere else. So they're going to be looking at these things as well to try and figure all this out, and then figure out where are those gaps, what are those deficiencies, and what do they need to do to plug them. And so that I think I don't know if you're going to see a THAAD type solution for that, but you're going to see something happen, and I imagine it's going to be pretty big, pretty dramatic, and pretty fast.
Hal, that brings me to my next question because I can't imagine that all of our viewers, including myself, are weapons experts, so to speak. Could you maybe give us a bit of a briefing on the different types of drones and which ones pose the biggest threat?
Well, there's different types of drones. There's a lot of different things of drones. I mean, when you get into some of the larger drones that the U.S. flies, those actually look like almost like commercial airliners. They're so big. So we have drones, the Triton series and things like that are used for persistent high altitude surveillance that fly, I'll say 60,000 feet plus above ground level, AGL. Those things tend to be very large. And then there's ones that are in a medium spectrum. They're larger. The MQ-9 Reaper fixed wing drone, we've lost a number of those due to the Houthis, but we've lost them elsewhere in the world as well. Those are fairly good size, and the Predator type drones. Certainly, when I was overseas in uniform, I was on the flight line right next to those, and got to see them up close and personal. And so they're. I mean, size is a relative thing. I mean, are they bigger than a Cessna or something? Well, yeah, they don't look like a Cessna, but they have getting a wingspan and things like that. They're pretty good size. And then you get down to smaller drones, and a number of these drones, some of them are fixed wing, a lot of them are rotor, quadcopters, and things like that. And if you get all the way down to the very smaller drones, you get to stuff like you saw with the drone that went into the living room, where Yahya Sinwar was sitting on a chair throwing a stick at it. Well, that drone, and I'm not entirely sure what type of drone that is, but that might be a drone that's akin to the Dragonfly series drone that we produce. And that's a drone that literally can sit on the palm of your hand. It's a very tactical drone. It doesn't have any weapons capability, but it's great for intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance at a very tactical level, like a squad or platoon, which is a small group of maybe a dozen or a couple of dozen. It tells you what's in that building, what's over that hill, what's around the corner. These are very, very small drones. Some call them micro UAVs, if you will, which is micro unmanned aerial vehicles. Very small. And I've seen stuff so small that literally it looks like the size of an insect. Some amazingly small drones. Again, not designed for weapons, although I have heard some other exotic applications of using them for assassination stuff and putting a very small explosive charge. And there's an Air Force video I've had that I use in my training where it actually shows the drone landing on a terrorist's head and then exploding. It's all done in cartoon, but you get the idea of what it does. And so these are all within the area of theory of what's going on. This drone here was probably, my guess, is a fixed wing drone that had pretty long legs. It could fly a pretty considerable distance. Obviously, had a warhead. And so they're going to be looking at that area of drones. But then again, that's why I say they're going to have to go back and take a look at this. This drone may have come from somewhere other than southern Lebanon, and they're going to have to figure out if maybe this was a different type of drone that was launched from a different direction. Maybe it was launched within Israel, or maybe it was launched from within the West Bank, or something like that. I don't have all the details. Everything they say so far makes it sound like it came from southern Lebanon, but more to follow. This is kind of breaking news.
Al, given all the topics that we've touched on in this conversation, and it was just two major headlines really that we discussed, but is Iran preparing, or are they ready for an all-out war with Israel?
Corral, that's kind of interesting. The problem Iran has is they don't have any way to really do an all-out war with Israel. First off, if I could quote the real estate saying, location, location, location. They have no border that they share with Israel. They've got a couple of countries between them and Israel. So, and they don't have a really robust, capable, mechanized ground force with a lot of aviation support where they could do something that, say, the United States could do. They're not going to do something like we did in 2003, where they went up to where we went to Baghdad. They couldn't pull something like that off. They're certainly not going to do something like Desert Storm. And I would point out, when you're looking at the geography, you go, well, they would have to cover, that times 10 to get over to Israel. So they're just really physically, they can't launch a ground war. There is really no conceivable way they could launch a ground war in Israel. So what you're looking at are missiles, planes, maybe ships. Things are going to be a little bit more distant. They don't have any naval infantry capability where they could do any landings ashore, no any way to project anything like that. They don't have any big airborne capability where they could drop troops into Israel, which would be somewhat preposterous to even think of Iran trying something like that. So they're somewhat limited. Israel, on the other hand, has a lot of force projection capability. They could theoretically put boots on the ground in Iran, although Iran, I just want to point out, is an enormous country. It is huge, and it's also a long way from Israel. So they've also got a problem of how do you logistically support such an operation? How do you get your forces back if you were to insert them in the first place? How do you insert them in the first place to get them in there? Although they could do some things like we saw in Syria not too long ago, where they did a strike on it was an Iranian facility in Syria that actually produced munitions. And they went in there with special operations forces, did a raid on the ground, boots on the ground, and then covered it up with airstrikes and drone strikes as they were leaving. That's very conceivable that something like that could happen in Iran. But I think right now what we're talking about is an exchange for Israel. A lot of airstrikes is what I would anticipate, using some of the advanced fighter bomber capabilities they have, like the F-35, F-16s, F-15s. They're provided by the U.S. Perhaps some drone capability. Obviously, things they can do in the covert realm with their clandestine services. And then the other side would be what Iran could do, which includes drones, but really what we've seen this last time was mostly ballistic missiles. But I would say the problem that Iran's going to run into is that once, depending on what the target sets are that Israel goes after, it's going to have a seriously debilitated capability to project force with both missiles and drones after Israel strikes. And I would not be surprised to see if that's one of the first things Israel does, is basically to take out their ability to respond with drones and missiles as a response to the Israeli strike.